Kira Vasquez sat in the back row of the classroom and tried to make herself invisible. She was 17 years old, and she was the only human in the entire school. The Galactic Unity Academy floated in space on a massive station called Meridian 7, and students from dozens of alien species came here to learn together and become the next generation of scientists and diplomats and leaders. But Kira was different from all of them. She came from Earth, and Earth what the galaxy called a death world. Other students had watched documentaries about her planet, and they knew all the terrible facts. Earth had gravity so strong it would crush the bones of most species. Earth had temperatures that swung from freezing cold to burning hot. Earth had a sun that blasted the surface with radiation. Earth had predators with sharp teeth and claws. Everywhere had storms and earthquakes and volcanoes and floods, and humans had survived all of it. Kira looked around the classroom and saw her classmates keeping their distance from her. As always, in the front row sat 3 Velith students, and they were beautiful creatures made of living crystal that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows, and they communicated through musical sounds and vibrations. To the left were the Thesari, and they looked like tall frogs with 4 arms and blue-green skin, and they were famous across the galaxy for being incredibly smart and calm. Near the windows sat a group of Karath, and they were thin and graceful with skin so pale you could almost see through it, and they ate only plants and moved like dancers. All of them were afraid of Kira. She had learned this on her very first day when she walked into the cafeteria, and every conversation stopped, and every eye turned to stare at her. Young Karath had actually fainted when Kira sat down near her. After that, Kira learned to move slowly and speak softly and keep her distance from everyone. She learned to eat alone in the corner of the cafeteria. She learned to study alone in her small room. She learned that friendship was not something she would find here. The other students whispered about her. When they thought she could not hear, they said humans were persistence predators who could chase prey for days without stopping. They said humans could heal from wounds that would kill anyone else. They said humans sweated poison from their skin. They said humans ate the dead flesh of other creatures and actually enjoyed it. Most of these things were true, and Kira could not deny them, so she stayed quiet, and she stayed small, and she tried not to scare anyone. Professor Velith Kora stood at the front of the class today, and he was an old Asari with gray-blue skin and kind eyes, and he was teaching them about extremophile lifeform. Extremophiles were creatures that could survive in extreme conditions, like boiling water or freezing ice or burning acid. Kira found it funny that she was sitting in a class about extremophiles when she herself came from an extremophile planet. Professor Velith Kora pointed to the screen with one of his 4 arms and showed them pictures of bacteria that lived in volcanic vents deep under the ocean. Life finds a way to adapt, the professor said in his calm voice. Even in the most hostile environments, the universe can create. Kira took notes on her tablet and tried to focus on the lesson, but she could feel the eyes of the Velith student next to her, and she knew he was watching her hands move and probably wondering if those hands could crush his crystal body. They could, but Kira would never do that. She was not a monster, even if everyone thought she was. The clock on the wall showed there were still 40 minutes left in class, and Kira was thinking about what she would eat for dinner alone in her room when the lights flickered. Everyone looked up. The lights flickered again and then went completely dark. For 3 seconds, there was total blackness and total silence. Then the sound exploded through the station, and it was a sound Kira had never heard before. It was a deep pulsing alarm that seemed to shake the walls and rattle the floor and vibrate inside. Her chest-red emergency lights came on and bathed the whole classroom in a bloody glow. A voice came through the speakers, and it was the calm computer voice of the station. Invasion alert. The voice said, "Hostile forces detected. All students shelter in place. This is not a drill." For one moment, nobody moved. Then chaos erupted. The Velith students began making high-pitched sounds of pure panic, and their crystal bodies flashed with frightened colors. The Thesari froze completely because that was how their species reacted to danger, and they became like statues. Korra stampeded toward the door because their instinct was to run and never stop running. Professor Velith Korra raised all four of his arms and shouted for calm, but nobody could hear him over the alarm. Kira did not panic. She did not freeze. She did not run. Something very old woke up inside her brain, and it was something that had been sleeping in human DNA for millions of years. Her ancestors had survived ice ages and predators and wars and plagues and every disaster the universe could throw at them, and they had passed down their survival instincts to her. Kira looked around the classroom with new eyes. She saw the exits and counted them. She saw objects that could be used as weapons. She saw places that could provide cover. She saw the reinforced panic room at the back of the class where students were supposed to shelter during emergencies. Her heart was beating fast, but her hands were steady and her mind was clear. Another announcement came through the speakers, but this one was broken and full of static. Breach detected in sectors 4, 7, and 12. The voice said, "Security forces overwhelmed. All personnel." The announcement cut off and did not come back through the viewport window. Kira could see something that made her blood run cold. Ships were attaching themselves to the outside of the station. They were ugly ships covered in spikes and rust, and they clamped onto the hull like parasites on a host. Kira recognized them from her security briefing. Skith raiders. They were insectoid pirates who attacked stations and ships across the galaxy, and they killed anyone who resisted and sold everyone else as slaves. An explosion shook the corridor outside, and the classroom door bent inward from the force. Professor Velith Korra finally got control of his voice. "The shelter chambers," he shouted and pointed at the reinforced room at the back. "Everyone inside now, quickly." Students rushed toward the shelter, and the door required a biometric scan to open, and students pressed their hands against the scanner one by one. But the power fluctuations were making the system slow and glitch, and student got through. Then another. It was too slow. There were still 23 students waiting when the classroom door exploded inward. 3 Sketh soldiers came through the smoke, and they were terrifying. They stood on 4 legs like insects, and they had 2 arms that held plasma rifles, and their bodies were covered in hard black armor made of their own shells. They made clicking and chittering sounds as they looked at the students. Kira could guess what they were saying. Fresh slaves, easy profit. The soldiers raised their weapons toward the group of terrified students, and Kira Vasquez stepped forward. She stepped in front of everyone, and she planted her feet. And she straightened her spine. She was done being quiet. She was done being small. She was done being afraid of what she was. "Get behind me," she said, and her voice was not soft anymore. The 3 Sketh soldiers stared at Kira, and their antennae twitched with confusion. They had raided dozens of stations like this one, and they had seen many different species. They had seen the crystalline Velith, who shattered when you hit them hard enough. They had seen the 4-armed Thesari who froze like statues when they were scared. They had seen the delicate Korath who ran and ran until their hearts gave out. But they had never seen a human before. Kira stood between the soldiers and her classmates, and she did not look like much. She was smaller than the Sketh, and she had no armor and no weapons and no claws. She was just a teenage girl in a school uniform. The lead soldier made a chittering sound that might have been a laugh. He raised his plasma rifle and pointed it at the cluster of students behind Kira, and he clearly expected her to move out of the way. She did not move out of the way. She moved forward. What happened next would become legend. The survivors would tell the story for years, and each time they told it, they would struggle to find the right words. The Velith students would say that Kira became music, and that she was a song of violence that was beautiful and terrible at the same time. The Thesari would say that she moved at speeds that should have been impossible for a creature of her size and mass. the Korath would simply say that she became what they had always feared she was. Kira crossed the distance between herself and the first soldier in 3 running steps. On most planets, those steps would have been normal, but Kira had grown up on Earth, where the gravity pulled at you with tremendous force and where every step required more strength than most species could. Imagine her muscles had developed in that crushing gravity, and they were dense and powerful in ways the Sketh could not understand. She hit the first soldier like a meteor hitting a moon. Her shoulder slammed into his chest, and the impact cracked his armor plating and sent him flying backward into the wall. The second soldier reacted quickly and fired his plasma rifle at her. The bolt of superheated energy hit Kira in the shoulder, and it burned through her uniform and into her flesh, and the pain was incredible. But Kira did not stop. This was another gift from her Deathworld. Humans could function through pain that would make other species collapse. Her ancestors had run for miles on broken legs to escape predators. Her ancestors had fought with spears in their guts. Her ancestors had survived wounds that would kill any other creature. Pain was just information, and Kira chose to ignore it. She grabbed the rifle from the second soldier and ripped it from his claws with a twisting motion that used her whole body. Human shoulders were strange things compared to most species. They could rotate in ways that other joints could not, and this allowed humans to throw objects with incredible force and accuracy. Kira used this ability now. She broke the rifle over her knee like it was a dry branch, and she drove the shattered end into the second soldier with all her strength. The Sketh made a horrible screaming sound and fell. The third soldier tried to run. He turned toward the door, and his legs scrambled against the floor as he tried to escape. But humans were persistent predators, and they did not let prey escape. Kira caught him before he reached the doorway, and her hand closed around his throat, and she lifted him off the ground. With one arm, the soldier chittered in panic, and his legs kicked in the air, and his antennae sent out distress signals to his comrades. Kira could feel his pulse under her fingers, and she could feel how fragile his neck was compared to a human neck. She thought about the students behind her, and she thought about what these raiders would do to them. She thought about the slave markets where they would be sold. She thought about the terror in their eyes. "Tell your friends," Kira said, and her voice was low and cold. "Tell them that this station is protected." She threw the soldier into the corridor, and he hit the metal wall with enough force to leave a dent in the shape of his body. Then she turned back to face her classmates. 23 students stared at her with wide eyes and open mouths. Professor Velith Kora had his 4 hands pressed against his chest, like he was having trouble breathing. The Velith students had stopped making their panic sounds and were completely silent. The Thesari had unfrozen from their terror and were blinking rapidly. The Karth had stopped trying to run and were huddled together in a group. They all looked at Kira like they were seeing her for the first time, and in a way they were. This was what a human really was. This was what a Deathworlder could do. Kira looked down at herself and saw the plasma burn on her shoulder and the blood running down her arm, and she realized she must look terrifying. "Sorry," she said, and her voice softened a little. "I know that was probably scary to watch." A sound came from the corridor outside, chittering more. Sketh were coming. Kira could hear their legs clicking against the metal floor, and she could hear them communicating with each other in their insect language. The third soldier had delivered her message, but it had not scared them away. Instead, it had made them curious. They wanted to see the strange creature that had killed 2 of their warriors with its bare hands. Kira looked at the shelter room where more students were still trying to get through the scanner. She looked at the students who were still stuck in the classroom with Hirsch. She made a decision. Everyone who can fit needs to get into the shelter room right now, she said. "Push through as fast as you can, and do not come out until help arrives." Professor Velith Kora found his voice. "What about you?" he asked. Kira walked toward the ruined doorway and picked up one of the plasma rifles from the fallen soldiers. She checked the power cell and found it still had plenty of charge. I will hold this room, she said. Alone? The professor asked, and his voice cracked. Kira looked back at him, and for a moment she smiled, and it was a strange smile that was sad and proud at the same time. Professor, she said, on my planet we have a saying. When the wolves come, you do not ask how many there are. You ask where you need to stand. She turned back to face the doorway. I know where I need to stand. The first wave of Sketh soldiers appeared at the end of the corridor. There were 6 of them this time, and they moved carefully, and they had their weapons raised and ready. They had heard what happened to the first 3 soldiers, and they were not going to make the same mistakes, but they still did not truly understand what they were facing. They did not understand that Kira came from a world where everything wanted to kill you, and where only the strongest and smartest and toughest could survive. They did not understand that humans had conquered their Deathworld and then looked up at the stars and conquered those too. They did not understand that the quiet girl who sat in the back of the classroom was the most dangerous thing on this station. Kira raised her stolen rifle and felt the weight of it in her hands behind, as she could hear students finally getting through the scanner and into the shelter room. She just needed to buy them time. She just needed to hold the line. Sketh soldiers charged down the corridor with their weapons firing, and Kira Vasquez went to war. What Deathworlders are made of? Kira fired the plasma rifle 3 times, and 3 Sketh soldiers fell before they knew what hit them. The remaining 3 scattered and took cover behind pillars in the corridor, and they began shooting back at her. With careful aimed shots, Kira ducked behind the doorframe and felt the heat of plasma bolts passing inches from her face. She was breathing hard now, and her shoulder wound was bleeding badly, and the pain was starting to push through her adrenaline. But pain was just information, and she chose to use it instead of letting it use her. Pain told her she was still alive. Pain told her she could still fight. She leaned out and fired again, and another Sketh fell with a hole in his chest. The last 2 soldiers decided that staying at range was a bad idea, and they charged toward her. With weapons blazing, Kira dropped the rifle because it was too slow for close combat as she met them with her bare hands. The first one swung a blade at her head, and she ducked under it and drove her fist into his stomach with all her strength. Human fists were strange weapons that no other species had ever developed. Most creatures bit or clawed or stung, but humans had learned to make their hands into hard balls of bone and muscle that could break things. Kira broke several of the soldier's internal organs with that punch, and he collapsed, making wet sounds. Second soldier grabbed her from behind and wrapped his arms around her throat and tried to choke her. This was a mistake. Humans had incredibly flexible spines compared to most species, and Kira twisted in his grip and got her feet against his chest and pushed with all the power of her Deathworld legs. The soldier flew backward and hit the wall, and before he could recover, Kira was on top of him, and her hands were around his head, and she twisted sharply. The corridor went quiet. Kira stood up slowly, and her whole body was shaking now from exhaustion and blood loss. She looked at the 6 dead soldiers around her, and she felt something complicated. She did not enjoy killing. She had never killed anything before today, but she knew with absolute certainty that she would do it again and again to protect the innocent people behind her. This was what humans were made for, not killing exactly, but protecting her. Ancestors had not just survived the Deathworld by being tough and dangerous. They had survived by working together and by protecting the weak members of their tribes and by fighting for each other. Kira heard more sounds from deeper in the station: plasma fire and explosions and screaming. Sketh were everywhere, and the station security forces were losing. She needed to make a choice. She could stay here and guard the doorway until help arrived, or she could leave the classroom undefended and go help fight in the corridors. It was not a hard choice. The students behind her were counting on her. When Kira dragged the bodies of the Sketh soldiers out of the doorway and took their weapons and power cells, she found a knife on one of them, and she liked the weight of it in her hand. Knives were ancient human weapons, and her ancestors had been using them for 100,000 years. She heard the scanner beep behind her, and she looked back and saw Professor Velith Cora helping the last few students into the shelter room. "That is everyone," the professor called to her. "Everyone except you. Please come inside where it is safe." Kira shook her head. "If I go in there with you, then there is nothing between the Sketh and that door," she said. "They will break through eventually, and then everyone inside will be trapped. But you cannot fight them all alone." The professor said. Kira smiled, and blood dripped from a cut on her forehead. "Professor," she said, "on my planet there is another saying. It is not about whether you can win. It is about whether you can make the enemy pay such a high price that winning is not worth it." She turned back to face the corridor. "I am going to make them pay." The professor stared at her for a long moment, and his 4 eyes blinked in a pattern that meant deep sorrow and deep respect. "I will record everything," he said softly, "so the galaxy will know what you did here today." The shelter door closed behind him. Kira was alone. She set up her defenses quickly because she knew she did not have much time. She pushed desks together to make barricades, and she positioned herself where she could see the corridor, but also have cover from plasma fire. She checked her weapons and found she had 2 plasma rifles and 3 power cells and 1 knife. It was not much, but it would have to be enough. The next wave came 5 minutes later. This time there were 12 of them, and they came with shields made of some kind of energy field that blocked her plasma shots. Kira had to let them get close before she could hurt them. It was brutal and ugly and nothing like the fights in movies. She shot 2 through gaps in their shield formation, and then she was in among them with her knife and her fists and her elbows and her knees. Sketh blade cut deep into her left arm, and she felt the muscle part, and she felt the blood pour out hot and fast. She killed the soldier who cut her and kept fighting. A plasma bolt hit her in the side, and she felt ribs crack, and she smelled her own flesh burning. She killed the soldier who shot her and kept fighting. A soldier tackled her to the ground and tried to crush her skull with his clawed hands. She gouged out his eyes with her thumbs and threw his body off her and kept fighting. When the 12 soldiers were dead, Kira stood in the middle of them, and she could barely see through the blood in her eyes, and she could barely breathe through the pain in her chest. Her left arm was almost useless now. Her side was a mess of burned flesh and broken bone. She had cuts and bruises everywhere, but she was still standing, and she would keep standing until she could not stand anymore. A sound came from the corridor, and it was not the sound of more soldiers. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged toward her. Kira squinted through the blood and saw what was coming. The Sketh had brought something big this time. It was some kind of war beast that they used for breaking through fortified positions, and it was as big as a ground vehicle and covered in spiky armor. Behind it came 20 more soldiers, and they were using the beast as cover. Kira looked at the monster coming toward her, and she felt fear for the first time since the battle began. But fear was just information. And Kira chose to ignore it. She picked up a plasma rifle in her one good hand, and she braced herself against the barricade, and she aimed at the eyes of the war beast. "Come on, then," she whispered to herself. "Let me show you what Deathworlders are made of." The beast roared and charged, and Kira fired. The plasma bolt hit the war beast directly in its left eye, and the creature screamed with a sound that shook the walls. It did not stop charging. Kira fired again and again, and she hit the other eye, and she hit the joints where its legs connected to its body, and she hit every weak point she could see. Beast crashed into her barricade and sent desks flying in every direction. Kira jumped to the side at the last moment and rolled across the floor and came up with her knife in her good hand. The beast was blind now, but it could still smell her, and it turned toward her with its massive jaws open wide behind it. The 20 Sketh soldiers poured into the classroom. Kira had to make a decision in less than a second: fight the beast or fight the soldiers. She could not fight both at once. She ran toward the beast, and she jumped. It was an insane thing to do, but humans were very good at doing insane things. When they had no other choice, she landed on the creature's back and grabbed onto the spikes of its armor, and held on as it bucked and twisted and tried to throw her off. The soldiers hesitated because they did not want to hit their own war beast with plasma fire. That hesitation was all Kira needed. She drove her knife into the back of the creature's skull, and she pushed with all her strength until the blade went through bone and into brain. Beast crashed to the ground and nearly crushed her beneath it. Kira rolled free and came up facing the 20 soldiers, who were now staring at her with something that might have been fear. She was covered in blood, both red and black, and she was breathing in ragged gasps, and she could barely stand upright, but she smiled at them. It was a human smile, and it showed her teeth, and it did not look friendly at all. "Who is next?" she asked. 3 soldiers charged at her, and she killed them with the knife before they could land a single blow. Then her legs finally gave out, and she fell to her knees. The remaining soldiers saw their chance and rushed forward. Kira could not stand anymore, so she fought from her knees. She killed 2 more before a plasma bolt took her in the leg, and she fell onto her back. She killed 1 more before they pinned her arms to the ground. A soldier pressed the barrel of a plasma rifle against her forehead, and she could feel the heat of the weapon warming up for a final shot. This was it. This was how she died. But at least she had bought enough time. At least the students in the shelter were safe. At least she had made the Sketh pay for every inch of ground. The soldier's finger tightened on the trigger, and then his head exploded. Kira heard plasma fire that was not coming from the Sketh, and she heard shouting in languages she did not recognize, and she heard the beautiful sound of Concord military dropships landing on the outer hull. The cavalry had arrived station. Security forces poured into the classroom, and they were wearing heavy armor and carrying military weapons, and they cut through the remaining Sketh like a laser through paper. A soldier in Concord colors knelt beside Kira, and his face was a species she did not recognize, but his eyes were kind. "Stay with me," he said. "Medical team is on the way. You are going to be okay." Kira tried to speak, but the only sound that came out was a wet cough. "How long?" the soldier asked someone. How long was she fighting alone? Another voice answered, and Kira could barely hear it through the ringing in her ears. According to the security logs, she held this position for 2 hours and 17 minutes. She killed 38 enemy combatants, including a Class 4 war beast. The soldier looked down at Kira with an expression she could not read. "By yourself?" he asked her softly. "You did all of this by yourself?" Kira managed a tiny nod. The soldier shook his head slowly. "I've been fighting for 20 years. He said, "I have never seen anything like this." "What are you?" Kira found enough strength for 2 words. "Just human," she whispered. Then darkness took her. When she opened her eyes again, she was in a bright room, and everything was white and clean. And there was a soft beeping sound coming from somewhere nearby. She tried to move, and pain shot through every part of her body. A Dazari doctor appeared above her, and his 4 eyes blinked rapidly as he checked the monitors next to her bed. "Do not try to move," he said. "You have 17 broken bones and severe plasma burns covering 15% of your body, and you lost nearly half your blood. By every medical standard, I know you should be dead." Kira licked her dry lips. "Humans are hard to kill," she said. The doctor made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been disbelief. "Clearly," he said, "you are in a regenerative pod, and the low gravity is helping your bones heal. You will be here for at least 3 weeks." Kira closed her eyes and let herself relax for the first time in what felt like forever. "The students?" she asked. "The ones in the shelter?" "All safe," the doctor said. "Every single one of them. Because of you." Kira felt something warm spread through her chest, and it was not pain this time. It was something better. "Good," she said. "That is good." She slept then, and her dreams were peaceful. In her dreams, she was back on Earth, and she was running through green forests under a blue sky, and the gravity that had always felt normal now felt like a gentle Hugin. Her dreams, her ancestors ran beside Her and they were warriors and hunters and protectors, and they smiled at her with pride. In her dreams, she understood that she was not alone. She had never been alone. She carried millions of years of human strength and courage inside her, and today, she had proven worthy of that inheritance. What she always was. 3 weeks passed slowly in the medical bay. Kira floated in her regenerative pod and watched her body put itself back together piece by piece. The doctors came every day, and they always looked at her with the same expression of confused amazement. They had never treated a human before, and they did not understand how her wounds were healing so fast. A Karath patient with a broken arm would take 3 months to recover. Kira would be walking again in 4 weeks. On the 5th day, Professor Velith Kara came to visit her. He stood at the edge of her pod, and his 4 hands were shaking as he looked at her. "I watched the security footage," he said. "I watched all of it." Kira did not know what to say, so she said nothing. "I have been teaching for 40 years, the professor continued. "I have had thousands of students from hundreds of species, but I've never seen anything like what you did." He paused, and his eyes blinked in a pattern that meant deep emotion. "I am ashamed," he said. "I am ashamed of how I treated you before. I was afraid of you because you were different, and I never tried to see past my fear." Kira shook her head slowly. "You were not the only one," she said. "Everyone was afraid. I understood. That does not make it right." The professor said, "You sat in my classroom for 6 months, and I never once asked you how you were feeling. I never once tried to make you feel welcome. And then when danger came, you stood between me and death without hesitation." His voice cracked. "You nearly died protecting students who had never shown you kindness." Kira reached out with her good hand and touched the professor's arm gently. "That is what humans do," she said. "We protect people. It does not matter if they are friends or strangers. When someone needs help, we help them." The professor stared at her for a long moment. "Your species terrifies me," he said finally, "and I think I'm only now beginning to understand why." He left without saying anything else, but Kira understood what he meant. Humans were not scary because they were violent. Humans were scary because they were violent in defense of others, and that made them unpredictable in ways that most species could not understand. On the 10th day, Velith's student came to visit. His name was Crystalline Song at Dawn, and he was the one Kira had protected during the battle. She remembered dragging him to safety when he was hurt and wrapping her shirt around his cracked surface to hold him together. He brought his family with him, and they were beautiful creatures of blue and green crystal that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows. They stood around her pod and they began to sing. The song was not made of words, but of pure tones and harmonics that seemed to resonate with something deep inside Kira's chest. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. When the song ended, Crystalline Song at Dawn spoke in his chiming voice. "That was a song of eternal bond," he said. "It is the highest honor my people can give. We have never sung it for someone outside our species before." Kira felt tears forming in her eyes, and she did not try to stop them. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," Crystalline Song at Dawn said. "Thank you. You saved my life. You saved all of our lives. We will never forget what you did." After that, more visitors came. Her classmates arrived in groups of 2 or 3, and they brought gifts and flowers and foods from their home planets. They talked to her about normal things like schoolwork and gossip, and they did not flinch when she moved, and they did not keep their distance. For the first time since she arrived at the academy, Kira felt like she might actually belong. On the 20th day, the Galactic Unity Council sent a representative to see her. He was an elderly Korath with wise eyes and silver patterns on his translucent skin, and he wore the formal robes of a high diplomat. "Kira Vasquez of Earth," he said. "The council has reviewed the events of the invasion, and we have made a decision." Kira tried to sit up straighter in her pod. "We are awarding you the Medal of Galactic Unity," the diplomat said. "It is the highest honor the council can give to a civilian." In the 300 years since the council was formed, we have given this medal only 11 times. He paused, and his expression softened. You will be the first human to receive it. The ceremony happened 2 weeks later when Kira was finally out of the pod and able to walk on her own. It was broadcast across 12 star systems, and billions of beings watched as the elderly diplomat placed the medal around her neck. Before he finished, he turned to face the cameras and gave a speech that would be quoted for generations. We called Earth a death world, he said, and we were not wrong. It is a planet of crushing gravity and extreme temperatures and deadly predators. He looked at Kira. We called humans dangerous, he continued, and we were not wrong. They are stronger than us and faster than us, and they can survive wounds that would kill any other species. He paused. But we forgot something important. We forgot that the same evolution that made humans terrifying also made them protectors. They did not just survive their death world. They survived it together. They protected each other. They fought for each other. They died for each other. His voice rose, and today a 17-year-old human girl stood alone against an army of raiders, and she did not run. She did not hide. She fought until she could not stand, and then she fought some more. Not for glory, not for reward, but because innocent people needed protection, and she was the only one who could provide it. He placed his hand on Kira's shoulder. This is what Deathworlders are made of. Not just the capacity for violence, but the choice to aim that violence at those who threaten the innocent. Today we are grateful that humanity is our ally. Today we are proud to call them friends. The crowd erupted in applause, and Kira stood there, with tears running down her face, and she finally understood something important. She had spent 6 months trying to hide what she was. She had tried to be small and quiet and unthreatening, but that was never who she really was. She was a human. She was a Deathworlder. She was a protector, and she was done apologizing for it when classes started again the next semester. Kira did not sit in the back row. She sat in the middle of the classroom, surrounded by friends who had finally stopped being afraid of what she was and started being grateful for it. A young Dasari first year walked into the classroom on the first day, and she looked around nervously at all the unfamiliar faces. Her eyes landed on Kira as she recognized the human from the broadcasts, and she froze. Kira smiled at her warmly. The seat next to me is empty, she said. Would you like to sit here? The young Dasari hesitated for just a moment, and then she smiled back and walked over and sat down. I am Kira. Kira said. I am Selith, the Dasari said. I have heard stories about you. They say you fought an army alone. Kira laughed softly. I did what anyone would do, she said. I protected the people around me. Selith shook her head. No, she said. Not anyone. Only humans. Only Deathworlders. She paused. I am glad you are on our side. Kira looked around the classroom at all the students who had once been afraid of her and were now her friends. She thought about the battle and the blood and the pain. She thought about the medal around her neck. She thought about her ancestors who had survived the death world and passed their strength down to her. So am I, she said, and she meant it, because this was the human way, not just to stand alone when darkness came, but to make sure that afterward nobody else would have to the end.